Hello, GW. Thank you very much, President Knapp, for that kind intro, Alex. Trustees, faculty and deans of the university, my fellow honorees, and especially you, the class of 2015, yes. Congratulations to you, to your family, to your friends that are attending today's ceremony. You made it. It's a privilege, a rare privilege of a lifetime to be with you today. And I can't thank you enough for making me an honorary colonial. Before I begin today, they asked me to make a standard announcement. You've heard this before, about silencing your phones. So those of you with an iPhone, just place it in silent mode. If you don't have an iPhone, please pass it to the center aisle. Apple has a world-class recycling program. You know, this is really an amazing place. And for a lot of you, I'm sure that being here in Washington, the very center of our democracy, was a big draw when you were choosing which school to go to. This place has a powerful pull. It was here that Dr. Martin Luther King challenged Americans to make real the promises of democracy, to make justice a reality for all of God's children. And it was here that President Ronald Reagan called on us to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds. I'd like to start this morning by telling you about my first visit here. In the summer of 1977, yes, I'm a little old, I was 16 years old and living in Robertsdale, the small town in southern Alabama that I grew up in. At the end of my junior year of high school, I'd won an essay contest sponsored by the National Rural Electric Association. I can't remember what that essay was about, but what I do remember very clearly is writing it by hand, draft after draft after draft. Typewriters were very expensive and my family could not afford one. I was one of two kids from Baldwin County that was chosen to go to Washington along with hundreds of other kids across the country. Before we left, the Alabama delegation took a trip to our state capital in Montgomery for a meeting with the governor. The governor's name was George C. Wallace. The same George Wallace who in 1963 stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to block African Americans from enrolling. Wallace embraced the evils of segregation. He pitted whites against blacks, the South against the North, the working class against the so-called elites. Meeting my governor was not an honor for me. My heroes in life were Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, who had fought against the very things that Wallace stood for. Keep in mind that when I grew up, I grew up in a place where King and Kennedy were not exactly held in high esteem. When I was a kid, the South was still coming to grips with its history. My textbooks even said the Civil War was about states' rights. They barely mention slavery. So I had to figure out for myself what was right and true. It was a search. It was a process. It drew on the moral sense that I'd learned from my parents and in church and in my own heart, and led me on my own journey of discovery. I found books in the public library that they probably didn't know they had. They all pointed to the fact that Wallace was wrong, that injustices like segregation have no place in our world, that equality is a right. As I said, I was only 16 when I met Governor Wallace, so I shook his hand as we were expected to do. But shaking his hand felt like a betrayal of my own beliefs. It felt wrong, like I was selling a piece of my soul. From Montgomery, we flew to Washington. It was the first time I'd ever been on an airplane. In fact, it was the first time I'd ever traveled out of the South. On June 15th, 1977, I was one of 900 high schoolers greeted by the new president, President Jimmy Carter, on the south lawn of the White House, right there on the other side of the ellipse. I was one of the lucky ones who got to shake his hand. Carter saw Baldwin County on my name tag that day and stopped to speak with me. He wanted to know how people were doing after the rash of storms that had struck Alabama that year. Carter was kind and compassionate. He held the most powerful job in the world, but he had not sacrificed any of his humanity. I felt proud that he was president, and I felt proud that he was from the South. In the space of a week, I'd come face to face with two men who had guaranteed themselves a place in history. They came from the same region. They were from the same political party. They were both governors of adjoining states, but they looked at the world in very different ways. It was clear to me that one was right and one was wrong. Wallace had built his political career by exploiting divisions between us. Carter's message, on the other hand, was that we are all bound together, every one of us. Each had made a journey that led them to the values that they lived by, but it wasn't just about their experiences or their circumstances. It had to come from within. My own journey in life was just beginning. I hadn't even applied for college yet at that point. For you graduates, the process of discovering yourself, of inventing yourself, of reinventing yourself is about to begin in earnest. It's about finding your values and committing to live by them. You have to find your North Star. And that means choices. Some are easy. Some are hard. And some will make you question everything. 20 years after my visit to Washington, I met someone who made me question everything, who upended all of my assumptions in the very best way. That was Steve Jobs. Steve had built a successful company. He had been sent away, and he returned to find it in ruins. He didn't know it at the time, but he was about to dedicate the rest of his life to rescuing it and leading it to heights greater than anyone could ever imagine. Anyone, that is, except for Steve. Most people have forgotten, but in 1997 and early 1998, Apple had been adrift for years, rudderless. But Steve thought Apple could be great again, and he wanted to know if I'd like to help. His vision for Apple was a company that turned powerful technology into tools that were easy to use, tools that would help people realize their dreams and change the world for the better. I had studied to be an engineer and earned an MBA. I was trained to be pragmatic, a problem solver. Now I found myself sitting before and listening to this very animated 40-something guy with visions of changing the world. It was not what I had expected. You see, when it came to my career in 1998, I was also adrift, rudderless. I knew who I was in my personal life, and I kept my eye on my North Star, my responsibility to do good for someone else other than myself. But at work, well, I always figured that work was work. Values had their place, and yes, there were things that I wanted to change about the world, but I thought I'd have to do that on my own time, not in the office. Steve didn't see it that way. He was an idealist. And in that way, he reminded me of how I felt as a teenager. In that first meeting, he convinced me that if we worked hard and made great products, we too could help change the world. And to my surprise, I was hooked. I took the job and changed my life. It's been 17 years, and I have never once looked back. At Apple, we believe the work should be more than just about improving your own self. It's about improving the lives of others as well. Our products do amazing things, and just as Steve envisioned, they empower people all over the world. People who are blind and need information read to them because they can't see the screen. People for whom technology is a lifeline because they're isolated by distance or disability. People who witness injustice and want to expose it. And now they can because they have a camera in their pocket all the time. Our commitment goes beyond the products themselves to how they're made, to our impact on the environment, to the role we play in demanding and promoting equality, and in improving education. We believe that a company that has values and acts on